My father abandoned me before I was born, never sent a single letter, and died without warning me he was leaving me everything. The people living on his ranch had no idea I existed. Long post. Worth it. Grab coffee. Background. My name is Daniel Reeves. I'm 52 years old. I teach high school history in Portland, Oregon. I drive a 2014 Honda Civic with a cracked dashboard, rent a 2-bedroom apartment I share with my cat, Thucydides, and until 8 months ago, my most significant financial asset was a 403(b) retirement account with roughly $67,000 in it. I've never been to Texas. I grew up knowing almost nothing about my father. My mother, Patricia, raised me alone in a series of apartments across the Pacific Northwest. When I was old enough to ask about him, she gave me the same answer every time, delivered with a kind of practiced calm that told me the question cost her something. He made his choices, Daniel. We made ours. His name was Robert Earl Calloway. I knew that much. I knew he was from Texas. I knew he left when my mother was 3 months pregnant and never came back. I had one photograph, grainy, shot in what looked like the late 1960s, of a tall man leaning against a truck, squinting into the sun. My mother kept it in a shoebox. When she passed 6 years ago from pancreatic cancer, I found the shoebox, looked at the photograph for a long time, and then put it back. There was nothing there for me to grieve. You can't miss someone you never had. I thought that was the end of Robert Earl Calloway. The letter. It arrived on a Tuesday in October. A thick cream-colored envelope with a return address from a firm called Hargrove, Peltier and Associates, attorneys at law, Amarillo, Texas. I almost threw it away. I get junk mail in official-looking envelopes constantly. But something made me open it at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, Thucydides watching me with his usual contempt. The letter was 3 pages long. Dense, formal, precise. I read it twice before any of it made sense. Robert Earl Calloway had died on September 3rd, following complications from a stroke. He was 79 years old. He had never married. He had no other documented biological children. And in a will drafted 14 months before his death, he had left the entirety of his estate, specifically the Calloway Ranch, comprising 800 acres in Deaf Smith County, Texas, assessed at approximately $3.4 million, to one Daniel Patrick Reeves, of Portland, Oregon. His son. The attorney's name was James Hargrove. His letter was careful and professional, acknowledging that this news might come as a shock, offering his condolences, and noting that there were certain complications regarding the property that would need to be discussed at my earliest convenience. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time. I thought about my mother, working double shifts at a diner in Tacoma so I could have new shoes for school. I thought about the shoebox. I thought about 37 years of silence from a man who apparently, at some point before he died, decided I mattered enough to include in a will. Then I called James Hargrove. The complications. James Hargrove turned out to be a soft-spoken man in his 60s who had practiced estate law in Amarillo for 30 years. He apologized for the complexity of what he was about to explain. He then explained it. Robert Calloway had a younger brother. Gerald Calloway, 67, a cattle rancher who had lived and worked on the Calloway Ranch for the better part of 4 decades. Gerald had managed the property after their parents died, after Robert moved to Lubbock and then to Amarillo, after the family fractured in the quiet, grinding way that rural Texas families sometimes do. Gerald had 3 adult children, Mark, Sheila, and Tommy Calloway, who had also grown up on the ranch and continued working it. 4 years, Gerald had operated under the assumption, and here Hargrove's voice became carefully neutral, that the ranch would pass to him upon Robert's death. There had been, he explained, a previous will. A will drafted in 1998 that named Gerald as primary beneficiary. What Gerald did not know, and what had apparently detonated his world on the day the new will was filed for probate, was that Robert had quietly engaged Hargrove's firm in the summer of 2 years ago and revised everything. "Mr. Reeves," Hargrove said, "I want to be straightforward with you. Gerald Calloway is contesting the will. He has retained counsel. His argument is that Robert was experiencing cognitive decline at the time the new will was drafted and was therefore not of sound mind. He is also arguing undue influence, though I will tell you candidly that I was the one who drafted the document. I met with Robert on 4 separate occasions, and I had him evaluated by a physician specifically because I anticipated this challenge. Robert Calloway was difficult, occasionally cantankerous, and not always pleasant to work with. But he was unambiguously competent." I asked why. Why had Robert done this? Hargrove paused. "He left you a letter, Mr. Reeves. It's sealed. I'll send it with the estate documents." What I decided. I'm a history teacher. I understand that events have causes, that human beings make decisions for reasons that are sometimes only visible in retrospect, and that the worst thing you can do when confronted with complexity is react emotionally before you understand what you're actually looking at. So I did not react emotionally. I took 2 personal days from school. I sat at my kitchen table with Thucydides and I read everything Hargrove sent me. The will, the deed, the property assessment, the physician's evaluation of Robert's cognitive function from 18 months before his death, the letter Robert had written to me, which I will get to. Then I started making a list of what I knew and what I needed to know. What I knew: I was the legal heir to an 800-acre cattle ranch in the Texas Panhandle. The will was properly executed. There was medical documentation supporting Robert's competency. The contesting party had weak legal standing but obvious motivation. What I needed to know: the actual condition of the property. What operations were currently running on it. What the Calloway family was doing in response to the probate filing. Whether there were any debts or liens against the estate. And, critically, what I actually wanted to do with an 800-acre cattle ranch in a state I'd never visited. I hired a Portland attorney named Susan Choi, who specialized in estate litigation and had a reputation for being methodical and relentless. I paid her retainer with money from savings I'd been putting away for a kitchen renovation. I told her I wanted to understand everything before I made a single public move. Smart, she said. The worst thing you can do right now is telegraph your intentions before you know what you're dealing with. I booked a flight to Amarillo for the following Friday. I did not tell Gerald Calloway I was coming. The letter. I should tell you about Robert's letter before I tell you about Texas. It was handwritten. 4 pages in a cramped, tilted script that I stared at for a while before realizing I was looking for my own handwriting in it and finding traces of it, which was disorienting. I'm not going to reproduce the whole letter here. It was a private thing and some of it remains private. But the relevant parts, the parts that explain why an old man in Amarillo decided, in the last years of his life, to find the son he'd abandoned. He had, he wrote, spent decades telling himself a story in which leaving was the right choice. He had been 26. He had been frightened. He had been, by his own admission, a coward wearing the costume of practicality. He and my mother had not been married. He had told himself she would be fine, that his family would be better served without him complicating it, that my mother, who was, he wrote, the most capable woman I ever knew, which I used as an excuse, didn't need him. He had found out about me through a mutual acquaintance in the mid-1980s. He had thought about reaching out. He had not. He had followed my life at a distance, with what he described as a combination of shame and something he couldn't name that was, I think, just longing. He knew I'd gone to university. He knew I'd become a teacher. He knew my mother had died. He wrote, I know I have no right to anything from you. Not forgiveness, not contact, not grief when I'm gone. What I'm giving you is not a gift so much as an accounting. Everything I built was built with the understanding, however selfish and delayed, that it was partially built on a debt to you. The ranch is not what I owe you. Nothing could be. But it is what I have. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in its envelope. I sat with it for a long time. Then I got on the plane. Update 1. Texas. Deaf Smith County is flat in a way that feels almost philosophical. The sky is enormous. The land is red and brown and dry and goes on in every direction until it meets the horizon with no particular ceremony. Driving from Amarillo in a rental car, I felt like I was moving across the surface of something ancient and indifferent. James Hargrove met me at his office, a neat, brick building on a quiet street, and we spent 2 hours going through documents before he drove me out to the ranch. I need to describe what I saw when we turned off the county road and through the gate. The ranch was, and I say this as a man who grew up in cities, genuinely beautiful. Rolling pasture. A windmill turning slowly in the distance. A stock pond catching the afternoon light. The main house was a 2-story structure that had been added onto several times over decades, giving it the particular character of a building that had evolved with the family that lived in it. There were cattle visible in the middle distance. Working equipment. The smell of hay and dust and something I couldn't identify but which felt, inexplicably, like something I had always almost known. Gerald Calloway was standing on the porch. He was a heavy man, broad through the chest, with white hair and sun-darkened skin and the particular expression of someone who has been told bad news and has had several weeks to compact his grief and confusion into something harder. Beside him stood a younger man, his son Mark, I would later confirm, with his arms crossed and an expression that required no interpretation. Gerald looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "You're Patricia's boy." "I am," I said. He looked at me for another moment. Then he said, "You've got his eyes." We didn't shake hands. I did not go inside the house that day. I asked to walk some of the property, which Hargrove facilitated. I spent 2 hours walking the land while Gerald watched from a distance, and I thought about everything and nothing, and I took photographs, and I breathed the air, and I tried to understand what I was feeling, which was complicated in ways I didn't have the vocabulary for yet. Before I left, Gerald said one more thing. He said it quietly, without aggression, which somehow made it more serious than a shout would have been. I've put 40 years into this land. My children grew up on it. I don't know what Robert was thinking, but I can tell you that whatever a court decides, this isn't finished. I told him I understood. I told him I hadn't come to make enemies. I told him I'd be in touch through my attorney. He nodded once and went inside. On the drive back to Amarillo, Hargrove said, that went better than I expected. Give it time, I said. Update 2. The contest and the counter. Back in Portland, with Susan Choi now coordinating with James Hargrove, I watched Gerald's legal challenge take shape over the following 6 weeks. His attorney, a man named Bradford Cole, who had a reputation in Amarillo for being aggressive, filed a formal will contest on 3 grounds: testamentary incapacity, undue influence, and what he characterized as suspicious circumstances surrounding the timing of the will's revision. He also filed a motion to maintain the estate's status quo pending litigation, meaning Gerald and his family would continue to occupy and operate the ranch while the contest moved through the courts. This was, Susan explained, not unusual. It was also, she explained, the part where many legitimate heirs made mistakes by either caving to the pressure or responding with matching aggression. What we're going to do, she said, is build an airtight record. Every piece of documentation. Every communication. We're going to be the most organized, most reasonable, most cooperative party in this dispute. And we're going to make Gerald's team look like exactly what they are. What they were. A family that had operated for years under an informal understanding that had no legal foundation, was now facing the consequences of the legally documented wishes of a man they had perhaps underestimated. Hargrove provided the physician's evaluation, comprehensive, clear, and conducted specifically in anticipation of this kind of challenge. He provided records of his 4 meetings with Robert, including notes. He provided character witnesses, Robert's accountant, his neighbor, his physician of 15 years. All testified to a man who was physically failing but mentally undiminished. Susan also, quietly, began requesting documentation from Gerald's camp regarding the ranch's operational finances over the past decade. This was not random. Hargrove had mentioned, carefully, that there were certain irregularities in how the ranch had been managed that Robert had been aware of and that had, in fact, accelerated his decision to revise his will. I'll come back to that. In the meantime, I was doing something else. Something I hadn't told anyone except Susan. I was learning about ranching. I am a historian by training. I believe in primary sources. I spent 6 weeks reading every book I could find about cattle ranching in the Texas Panhandle, about land management, about water rights, about the specific agricultural and operational context of Deaf Smith County. I watched documentaries. I found an extension program through Texas A&M that offered online seminars on ranch management. I had not yet decided what to do with the ranch. But I had decided that when I made that decision, I would make it as an informed person. Update 3. The irregularities. Susan's document request was initially resisted. Bradford Cole argued it was overreaching, irrelevant to the will contest, an attempt to harass his clients. The judge, a measured woman named Honorable Delia Ruiz, disagreed and ordered compliance. What came back was illuminating. Over the previous 11 years, Gerald Calloway had been operating the ranch under a management agreement, informal, never formalized in writing, with Robert. He had been compensated for his management. He had also, according to the financial records now in our possession, been making a series of decisions that had significantly benefited himself and his children at the ranch's expense. Equipment purchased through ranch accounts and used on a separate property Gerald's son Tommy owned. Cattle sold at below market rates to a buyer who turned out to be Gerald's brother-in-law. A grazing lease on a portion of the ranch's acreage that directed payments not to the ranch's operating account, but to an LLC registered in Gerald's daughter Sheila's name. None of this was, individually, dramatic. In aggregate, it painted a picture of a man who had treated a property he didn't own as though he did, and had been directing its value into his own family's pockets for over a decade. Hargrove confirmed what I had suspected. Robert had discovered this. An accountant he'd hired for an unrelated purpose had noticed the discrepancies during a routine review. Robert had confronted Gerald. The confrontation had been, by Robert's account in a memorandum he left with Hargrove, ugly. Gerald had argued that he was owed the money, that decades of labor entitled him to informal compensation. Robert had disagreed. 3 months later, Robert had revised his will. Susan laid it out for me clearly. Gerald's will contest is now a significant liability for him. If we proceed to full litigation, The financial irregularities become part of the record. His attorney knows this. I expect we'll receive a settlement inquiry within 30 days. What do we want out of a settlement? I asked. That's up to you, she said. What do you want? This was the question I had been sitting with since October. What did I actually want? I thought about my mother. I thought about the letter in the cream envelope. I thought about the land, the windmill, the stock pond, the smell of hay and dust. I thought about Gerald standing on the porch saying, "You've got his eyes," with an expression that was complicated in ways I recognized because I had seen the same complication in my own face in the mirror. I thought about 40 years. I want what Robert wanted, I said. I want what's mine. But I don't want to destroy people to get it. Susan looked at me for a moment. That's a reasonable position, she said. Let me see what I can do with it. Update 4. Negotiations. Gerald's attorney called Susan 3 weeks later. Not 30, 21. The document production had apparently concentrated minds. The negotiation took 6 weeks. It was not pleasant. Gerald's initial position was essentially that he deserved the ranch because he had worked it. My position, communicated through Susan with consistent professionalism, was that the will was valid, the contest would fail, and the only question was how we got from here to resolution. Several things happened during those 6 weeks. First, Bradford Cole quietly advised Gerald that the will contest was unlikely to succeed. Hargrove's documentation was too thorough, the physician's evaluation too clear, and the financial irregularities created a serious counterthreat. Gerald's position in a courtroom was weak and getting weaker. Second, I flew back to Amarillo. Not for legal proceedings, for a meeting that Susan and I had requested, without attorneys, with Gerald and his family. This was not something Susan was initially comfortable with. She worried I would be manipulated or make commitments I shouldn't. I told her I understood the risk and that I needed to have a conversation that lawyers couldn't have for me. We met at a diner in Hereford, the county seat. Gerald came with his son Mark and his daughter Sheila. Tommy, the youngest, didn't come. I came alone. We ordered coffee. For a while nobody said anything useful. Then Gerald said, "I don't understand what you want from this." I told him the truth. I told him I hadn't asked for any of this. I told him I had no grievance with him personally, that his quarrel was with Robert and Robert was dead and beyond being quarreled with. I told him I understood that he had built a life on that land and that this was genuinely unfair to him, regardless of the legal and financial complexities. But, I said, I can't give it back to you. Not because I don't understand your position. Because it isn't mine to give back. It was Robert's. He made a decision. I didn't ask him to make it, but he made it, and I'm not going to undo a dead man's stated intentions. Sheila, who was sharp and direct in a way I found myself respecting, said, "What are you going to do with an 800-acre ranch? You've never ranched in your life." "I know," I said. "That's something I'd like to talk about." And then I laid out what I'd been thinking. The ranch was a working cattle operation. It required people who knew how to run it. I was a high school history teacher in Portland with a cat named after a Greek historian. I was not about to pretend I could manage the Callaway Ranch alone. What I proposed was this: a formal, paid ranch management agreement. Gerald and his family could continue to operate the ranch under a proper, legally documented, financially transparent contract. Fair market compensation. Annual accounting. Clear terms. For a period of 3 years, during which time I would decide what I wanted to do with the property long-term, whether to continue the arrangement, sell, or find another path. The financial irregularities would not be pursued, provided Gerald withdrew the will contest and the agreement was honored. Silence at the table. Mark said, "You'd trust us to manage it after all this?" "I'd trust a properly written contract," I said. "And I'd trust that we all understand the alternative." Sheila looked at her father. Gerald was looking at the table. He was a man who had lost something enormous and was being offered something smaller in its place, and I watched him decide whether smaller was better than nothing. He looked up. "I'll need my attorney to review it." "Of course," I said. We shook hands when we left the diner. It was the first time we'd touched. Update 5. Resolution. The will contest was withdrawn in February. The management agreement was signed in March. James Hargrove presided over the execution of the estate, and I became the legal owner of the Callaway Ranch on a Tuesday morning with about as much ceremony as a handshake and a notary stamp. I was back in Portland by Thursday. I taught my junior American history class on Friday. We were doing the progressive era. I stood in front of 30 teenagers and talked about Teddy Roosevelt's antitrust suits and thought about land and inheritance and the complicated arithmetic of what one generation leaves to another. Here's what the resolution actually looked like, in practical terms. Gerald Calloway and his family continue to run the ranch under a management contract that pays them fairly for their labor and is audited annually by an independent accountant. Tommy, who had been the most hostile and who didn't come to the diner meeting, came around after the contract was signed. Partly, I think, because the alternative was losing everything. Sheila, it turns out, has a genuine gift for ranch management and has been the most professional of the three in executing the agreement. The ranch generated, in its first full operational year under the formal agreement, enough revenue to cover management costs, make improvements to the property that had been deferred for years, and send me a quarterly distribution that has materially changed my financial situation for the first time in my adult life. I visited the ranch again in June. And again in September. On the June visit, Gerald showed me the property properly, the whole thing, not just what was visible from the house. We rode ATVs across the pasture. He showed me the stock pond, which he'd managed for 30 years. He showed me the fence lines, the windmill, the section of the property that ran along a dry creek bed that flooded in heavy rain. He was not warm exactly. He remained a man with complicated feelings about my existence. But he was professional, and occasionally something that was almost respect passed between us, and I thought that might have to be enough. On the September visit, I stayed for 4 days. I slept in one of the upstairs bedrooms of the main house, in a room that had apparently been Robert's study. There were bookshelves. History books, mostly. Military history, Western American history, Texas history. I sat in Robert's chair and looked out at the land through Robert's window and tried to feel something definitive about him and didn't quite manage it. What I felt instead was something more diffuse. A sense of being part of a longer story than I'd previously understood myself to be in. Not resolution, exactly. Not forgiveness. I hadn't decided whether there was something to forgive or whether forgiveness was even mine to give, since the person most wronged was my mother and she was gone. But something. I brought Robert's letter with me on the September trip. I reread it sitting in his chair in his study. Then I put it in his bookshelf, between a biography of Sam Houston and a history of the XIT Ranch. It seemed like a reasonable place for it. Where things stand now. It has been 8 months since the cream-colored envelope arrived at my apartment in Portland. I still teach high school history. I still drive the 2014 Honda Civic, though the cracked dashboard has been replaced. My 403(b) has been supplemented by an investment I made using my first quarterly distribution from the ranch. Thucydides is unchanged and continues to find me inadequate. I have not decided what I will ultimately do with the Calloway Ranch. The 3-year management agreement gives me time to think clearly, which is all I have ever wanted, time to understand a thing before I make a decision about it. What I know is this. An old man in Amarillo, Texas, spent 50 years making a choice and then, in the final years of his life, tried to make a different one. He couldn't undo what he had done. He couldn't give my mother back the years she spent alone. He couldn't be a father retroactively. He could only do what he had, which was land and the legal machinery to direct it. I didn't ask for any of it. But I have tried to be worthy of the complication. Gerald Calloway told me something on the September visit, while we were standing at the edge of the stock pond watching the cattle move in the distance. He said, "Robert talked about you sometimes. In the last few years. He'd gotten your address from somewhere. He'd written letters he never sent." I didn't say anything. "He kept them in his desk," Gerald said. "I found them after. Didn't know what to do with them. They're still there, in the desk in the study." I went back to the study after dinner. I opened the desk. There was a bundle of letters, maybe a dozen, held together with a rubber band. All addressed to me. All unsealed. All dated across the last 8 years of Robert's life. I haven't read them yet. I'm not sure when I will. Some things deserve to be approached at the right speed. Some histories take time to understand. But I will. TLDR, received a letter from a Texas attorney. My absent father died and left me an 800-acre, $3.4 million ranch. The uncle who expected to inherit it contested the will and was running irregular finances on the property. Negotiated a settlement, established a formal management agreement, now own a ranch in the Texas Panhandle while still teaching high school in Portland. Found a bundle of unsent letters in my dead father's desk. Have not yet read them. I'm okay. Edit. For those asking, yes, I will post an update when I read the letters. Give me some time. Edit 2. To everyone who's asked about Gerald, he's not a villain. He's a man who made assumptions and then made worse choices when those assumptions collapsed. I don't think that makes him evil. I think it makes him human in the way most of us are human, which is to say imperfectly, and usually more afraid than we appear. Edit 3. Thucydide says hello. He does not mean it.